The demo for Heroes of Might and Magic Olden Era is publicly available. And as someone who's played nearly every Heroes of Might and Magic, the only one I haven't played actually is the first one. I even played Dragonbone Staff for the PS2. I've decided to share my thoughts on the demo. Now, I'm not going to go through and explain every single mechanic in this demo because I assume most people watching this have at least a basic understanding of Heroes of Might and Magic. Instead, I'm going to focus on the new features this demo shows off and my thoughts on them. We're going to start with one I absolutely hate. A hero limit. So I hate this idea pretty much on principle. I don't really like the idea of restricting how many heroes can be created. I understand the principle behind it because heroes are rather powerful, so putting limits on them is probably a good idea. But if it's something that had to be done, I'd rather it be a choice the player makes. For example, by having it be an option they pick when starting the game, instead of it having it just be a flat, universal mechanic. As I said, I simply don't like the idea. If I want to make 20 heroes, then why not let me? Or at least let me choose a setting that lets me make 20 heroes. Either way, let's move on. One mechanic that's making its return that I do like is the idea of alternate upgrades for units. This mechanic was first introduced in Heroes of Might and Magic 3, but then fully expanded in Heroes of Might and Magic 5. Basically, instead of having a linear upgrade path for your units, you have access to 2 choices of units. I quite like this mechanic as it adds a little variation to armies and units. Instead of simply having flat-out upgrades from the earlier version to the later version, it's now a choice between 2 different versions. And some of them are rather different. For example, one of the upgrades turned a unit into a ranged unit, or the other one kept it as a melee one but strengthened its melee attack. So there's potential for some interesting choices, although I feel like picking the ranged unit will always be the smarter play. But maybe that's just me as someone that favours ranged attackers. A new mechanic that I'm not quite sure on is the idea of laws. This Frostpunk-like mechanic, where every day you gain lore points based on the amount of cities and heroes you control, which you then spend for permanent upgrades, is rather similar to a research tree. My main problem with this mechanic is it feels like a rich gets richer mechanic. After all, the person with the most towns and heroes gets the most lore points, which means they get the most upgrades, which means they become stronger faster and get more passive buffs faster. So it's easy to see how this mechanic would just make the strongest player stronger in the game instead of giving players on the back foot a boost, which may be what it's intended to do. But someone who already has the most towns and heroes is already the strongest, so do they need further buffs? As I said, I'm just not sure about the mechanic in its current state, and I'm not sure how to change it in such a way that it wouldn't create this problem. Moving on to another mechanic, we have magic, which has been changed quite a bit. Instead of having mage guilds that provide spells at random, we now have access to a star constellation map where we unlock individual spells by spending resources. Another mechanic I'm not quite sure on, mainly because I quite liked the random nature of guilds in the previous titles. It meant you had to often play with what you were given instead of simply choosing the best option when it came to spells. I also really don't like the idea of arcane dust, a resource that you can't produce but you must trade for or sacrifice items for, which can then be used to buff artifacts and items, making them stronger by increasing their level, or spells by doing the same thing. I don't really see the point of making items more powerful by buffing them in this way. It just doesn't really make much sense to me. Outside of, we can just do it. And spells, I actually really don't like, because the whole point is spells get stronger based on your hero's spell power. So if there's now a mechanic that just makes spells stronger by default, it kind of weakens the whole point of having a high spell power hero. At least that's my initial take on the situation. It could be that upgrading spells in this way doesn't have a big impact, but then if it doesn't, I would say, what's the point of it even being in the game as a mechanic? And I actually feel that way about quite a lot of mechanics added that we've seen in this demo, that there just doesn't seem much of a reason to add them outside of saying, oh look, we've added a new mechanic. Which sounds pretty mean to say, saying it out loud. But let's move on to another mechanic, the idea of hero skills having sub-bonuses or perks. So the way it worked in previous Heroes of Might and Magic, you unlock a skill and you simply get that skill's bonuses. Now when you unlock skills, they come with passive buffs that you must select one of. Again, another mechanic I'm not quite sure on. I do like how some of these perks synergize with other perks. For example, you'll see one that will give you a bonus and it says something like, if you have another skill with another similar perk, then they will amplify each other. And that reminds me of Heroes of Might and Magic 4's synergy classes, which I think was a great mechanic and I wish that other Heroes of Might and Magics had made use of. I suppose I don't hate the mechanic because again it just adds more player choice instead of just being flat out buffs like laws. But again, it feels like a mechanic that we didn't really need and doesn't change the game much, but is just kind of tacked on. Honestly, it sounds like I'm pretty negative about this demo, but I'm not really. I'm just not sure about these new mechanics that are added on. Essentially, without all these, the game is almost indistinguishable from earlier Heroes Might and Magics like 3. And I know some people will likely take fault with me saying that, but I do feel that way. The gameplay is much similar to older Heroes of Might and Magics instead of the more newer modern ones like 7 or 6. Though another mechanic that it does inherit from Heroes of Might and Magic 7 is the idea of your hero actually being able to do things in battle. In 7, your heroes could just attack by default and also had a special ability based on their race, and we have something similar here. For example, the dungeon heroes can take a stance which boosts their defense, spell power, or attack, and they can also attack. Whereas the schism heroes can only attack. But unlike in Heroes of Might and Magic 7, you can't just attack by default every turn. Instead, you have a focus bar that builds up as you take damage and deal damage, which you can then use to use your hero, as well as use certain skills. There's actually quite a few skills that your individual units have that are locked behind this focus meter and can only be activated once they reach certain points, and then that of course decreases it. This is one of the few new mechanics I don't really have a problem with, mainly because I felt like units in most games, that being Heroes of Might and Magics, usually didn't have much going for them other than attacking and sometimes passive abilities that happened when they attacked. So having active abilities I think is a good idea, just to add some diversity to how units behave. And on top of that, making it so they can't just spam their unique abilities, but they actually have to gain the points to use them is a good idea. Overall, despite everything I've said, I am quite positive about this demo. Although, playing it did just make me want to play Heroes of Might and Magic 3, which maybe that's what they're aiming for, to create an experience that's reminiscent of Heroes of Might and Magic 3. Personally, I think chasing Heroes of Might and Magic 3 is a fool's errand, because even if a game came out and it was better than Heroes of Might and Magic 3 in every way, it wouldn't have the nostalgia factor that Heroes of Might and Magic 3 has. I mean, Heroes of Might and Magic 3 is a classic with literally decades of good memories and fun times associated with it. How can anyone compete, right? Either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this demo if you've played it, especially if you're a veteran of the franchise. Am I the only one thinking the way I am about some of these mechanics? Or do you share my thoughts, or even have your own takes? I'd love to hear them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.